Marcus Rivera had always been the kind of man who preferred shadows to spotlights. At 42, he carried himself with a quiet dignity that spoke of years lived far from the comfortable suburban neighborhood where he now resided. His weathered hands told stories his mouth never would, and his eyes held depths that most people couldn't fathom. The local Veterans Affairs office had become his second home over the past 6 months. Not because he needed extensive medical care, but because he found purpose in helping other veterans navigate the complex system of benefits and support services. Marcus understood better than most how overwhelming the transition from military to civilian life could be. On this particular Tuesday morning, Marcus sat across from Tom Bradley, a 28-year-old former Army sergeant who was struggling with PTSD and unemployment. Tom's file lay open between them, filled with forms that seemed designed to confuse rather than help. "I just don't understand why they need all this paperwork," Tom said, his voice carrying the familiar edge of frustration that Marcus had heard countless times before. "I served my country for 8 years. Shouldn't that be enough?" Marcus nodded thoughtfully, his calloused fingers turning the pages slowly. He had learned that rushing through these sessions often did more harm than good. "The system isn't perfect, Tom, but every form has a purpose even when it doesn't feel that way. Let's break this down piece by piece." As they worked through the disability claim forms, Marcus noticed Tom's eyes occasionally drifting to his left forearm. The tattoo there was partially visible beneath his rolled-up sleeve, showing what appeared to be a simple anchor design. It was nothing elaborate, just black ink on weathered skin, but something about it seemed to capture Tom's attention. "Navy?" Tom asked during a brief pause in their work. Marcus glanced down at his forearm and nodded. "Long time ago," he said simply, pulling his sleeve down slightly. It was his standard response to questions about his service. Not dismissive, but not inviting further inquiry either. The morning passed quietly as they completed the paperwork. Marcus had a gift for making the complex seem manageable, breaking down each section into understandable pieces. By the time they finished, Tom looked noticeably more relaxed. "I can't thank you enough for this," Tom said as they shook hands. "Most people just hand you the forms and wish you luck." Marcus smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious face. "We look out for each other. That's what we do." After Tom left, Marcus remained in the small conference room, organizing the papers they had worked on. The VA office was quieter now, with most of the morning appointments completed. Through the window, he could see the parking lot where a group of young men in Navy uniforms were gathered around a pickup truck, their laughter carrying across the distance. Sarah Chen, the office coordinator, knocked on the doorframe. "Marcus, there's a group here for the community outreach meeting. They're early, but I can set them up in conference room B if you're ready." Marcus checked his watch. The Navy SEAL team from the local base was scheduled to discuss their transition program with interested veterans. It was supposed to be an informal meet and greet, the kind of event the VA organized to build bridges between active duty and veteran communities. "Send them in," Marcus said, straightening his shirt. He had mixed feelings about these meetings. While he appreciated the intention behind them, he often found that the gap between active duty personnel and veterans was wider than most people realized. The door opened, and 6 young men in crisp Navy uniforms filed in. Their bearing immediately identified them as special operations, with the confident stride and alert eyes that came from years of elite training. The team leader, a lieutenant whose name tag read Patterson, stepped forward with an extended hand. "Mr. Rivera?" "Lieutenant Patterson, thanks for taking the time to meet with us today." Marcus shook his hand, noting the firm grip and direct eye contact. "Just Marcus is fine. Please, have a seat." As the SEALs settled around the conference table, Marcus could feel them sizing him up. It was nothing personal, just the automatic assessment that military personnel learned to do with everyone they met. He had done the same thing countless times during his own service. "We're here to talk about our transition assistance program," Patterson began. "Command thinks it would be valuable to get input from veterans who've successfully made the transition to civilian life." One of the younger SEALs, whose name tag identified him as Petty Officer Rodriguez, leaned back in his chair. "No offense, sir, but what kind of background do you have? We're dealing with some pretty specialized issues coming out of special operations." Marcus noticed the subtle change in the room's atmosphere. It wasn't hostile, but there was definitely a sense of skepticism. These men had spent years in an elite community where credentials mattered, where respect was earned through proven capability under extreme conditions. I understand your concerns, Marcus replied evenly. Every branch, every unit, every deployment brings its own challenges. What I've learned is that the transition difficulties often have more similarities than differences. Another SEAL, Petty Officer Williams, spoke up. With respect, sir, unless you've been downrange with a team, it's hard to understand the bonds we're talking about. The brotherhood. Leaving that behind isn't like leaving a regular job. Marcus could see nods around the table. These men had absolute faith in each other, forged through shared dangers and victories. The idea that a civilian veteran could understand their specific challenges clearly didn't sit well with them. You're right, Marcus said, surprising them with his agreement. Every veteran's experience is unique. What I can offer is perspective on the practical side of transition, benefits, education opportunities, job placement, the administrative side that everyone has to deal with. The meeting continued for another hour, covering various aspects of the transition program. The SEALs were polite but remained somewhat distant, treating Marcus as a helpful civilian rather than a fellow warrior. As they prepared to leave, Rodriguez noticed Marcus adjusting his sleeve again. That's a Navy tattoo, Rodriguez observed, his tone slightly more interested. Marcus nodded. Yes, it is. What did you do in the Navy? Patterson asked. This and that, Marcus replied with a slight smile. Long time ago, like I said. The SEALs exchanged glances. The non-answer was clearly unsatisfying, but Marcus's demeanor didn't invite further pressing. As they filed out of the conference room, Marcus could hear one of them mutter something about support personnel and rear echelon. He didn't take offense. These young warriors had every right to be proud of their service and protective of their brotherhood. Marcus had been the same way once, a lifetime ago. Sometimes the most important lessons came not from what you said, but from what you chose not to say. The next few weeks brought an unexpected development. Lieutenant Patterson had apparently been impressed enough with Marcus's practical knowledge to invite him to speak at the base. The invitation came through Sarah Chen, who seemed more excited about it than Marcus felt. This is a big deal, Marcus, she said, waving the official letter. They want you to address their transition readiness seminar. That's not something they ask just anyone to do. Marcus read through the invitation carefully. The seminar was designed for SEALs nearing the end of their service commitments, focusing on the practical aspects of returning to civilian life. It was exactly the kind of work Marcus found meaningful, even if the audience might be skeptical. The naval base was a 40-minute drive from the VA office, through suburbs that gradually gave way to the stark functionality of military infrastructure. At the main gate, Marcus presented his identification to a young sailor who couldn't have been more than 20. The contrast between this fresh-faced guard and the battle-hardened SEALs he would be addressing wasn't lost on him. The base itself was exactly what Marcus expected. Clean, efficient, and purposeful. Every building, every sign, every landscaped area spoke of an organization that valued order and precision. It brought back memories he usually kept buried, of a time when his life had been governed by similar principles. Patterson met him at the main administration building, looking more relaxed in his working uniform than he had in the VA office. Marcus, glad you could make it. The guys are eager to hear what you have to say. As they walked across the base, Patterson provided a running commentary on the facilities. The SEAL compound was separate from the main base, hidden behind additional security and unmarked buildings. It was a world within a world, designed to house and train some of the military's most elite operators. How many will be in the audience? Marcus asked as they approached a nondescript building. About 30, Patterson replied. Mix of guys with different amounts of time left on their contracts. Some are already decided about getting out. Others are still on the fence. The briefing room was standard military issue. Folding chairs arranged in neat rows, a projection screen at the front, motivational posters on the walls, but the men filing in were anything but standard. Each carried himself with the relaxed confidence that came from years of elite training and successful missions. Marcus recognized several faces from the VA meeting, including Rodriguez and Williams. As the SEALs took their seats, he could feel the familiar assessment happening again. These men were evaluating him, trying to place him in their understanding of military hierarchy and capability. Patterson called the room to attention and introduced Marcus with a brief overview of his work at the base. The introduction was respectful but generic, focusing on his civilian credentials rather than his military background. When Patterson finished, Marcus stepped to the front of the room. "Before we begin," Marcus said, his voice carrying easily to the back of the room, "I want to acknowledge something. Some of you are wondering what a civilian volunteer can tell you about transition that you don't already know." A few nods around the room confirmed his assumption. "The truth is, I can't tell you how to maintain the brotherhood you've built. I can't tell you how to replace the sense of purpose you get from your missions. Those are personal challenges that each of you will have to work through in your own way." The room was quiet, attentive. Marcus had their interest even if he didn't yet have their respect. "What I can tell you about is the practical side, the paperwork that will determine your benefits, the education programs that can set you up for civilian careers, the job placement services that actually work versus the ones that waste your time." For the next hour, Marcus walked them through the maze of veteran services with the same methodical approach he used at the VA. He covered everything from disability ratings to home loan programs, from job interview techniques to dealing with civilian employers who didn't understand military experience. During the break, several SEALs approached him with specific questions. Marcus found himself genuinely enjoying these conversations. These men might be skeptical about his background, but they were serious about their futures. Rodriguez was among those who lingered after the formal session ended. "You really know this stuff," he admitted. "Most briefings like this are just some guy reading from a manual." "Experience," Marcus replied simply. "I've seen what works and what doesn't." "What did you do in the Navy?" Rodriguez asked again, his curiosity clearly growing. Marcus was saved from answering by the arrival of Williams, who had been talking to Patterson near the door. "Hey Rodriguez, we're heading to the base club for lunch. You coming?" Rodriguez looked at Marcus. "You want to join us? Unofficial continuation of the seminar?" Marcus hesitated. He had learned over the years that these informal gatherings often revealed more about military culture than any official briefing. "Sure, if I'm not intruding." The base club was a typical military establishment. Functional furniture, reasonably priced food, and walls covered with unit photos and memorabilia. The SEAL table was in a corner, providing good sightlines and easy conversation. As they settled in with their meals, the conversation naturally turned to deployments and experiences. Marcus listened more than he spoke, noting the easy camaraderie and shared understanding that bound these men together. It was something he remembered from his own service, the sense of belonging to something larger than yourself. "So, Marcus," William said during a lull in the conversation, "Rodriguez here is convinced you're hiding something. Navy tattoo know way too much about military benefits, but you won't talk about your service." The table went quiet. It wasn't hostile, but there was definitely curiosity. Marcus could feel them waiting for his response. "Not hiding anything," Marcus said calmly. "Just don't see the point in dwelling on the past." "Come on," Rodriguez pressed. "What's the story with the anchor tattoo?" "That's not some generic Navy ink. That's specific to something." Marcus glanced down at his forearm, where the edge of the tattoo was visible below his rolled-up sleeve. To these men, it probably did look like a simple anchor design. They couldn't see the full image, couldn't know what it really represented. "It's just an anchor," Marcus said with a slight smile. Seemed like a good idea at the time. Patterson, who had been quiet during most of the exchange, leaned forward. "You know, we can look up your service record if we really wanted to. Basic information is available through official channels." Marcus met his gaze steadily. "You're welcome to do that, Lieutenant. You might be surprised by what you find, or you might not find anything at all." The conversation moved on to other topics, but Marcus could sense the SEALs filing away his responses for later discussion. These men were trained to gather intelligence, to piece together information from incomplete sources. His evasiveness was probably more intriguing than any story he could have told. As the lunch wound down, Rodriguez made one more attempt. "Seriously, Marcus, we'd respect you more if you were straight with us about your background. It's obvious you know more than you're letting on." Marcus stood to leave, pulling his sleeve down to fully cover the tattoo. "Respect isn't something you can demand, Rodriguez. It's something you earn. In my experience, the people who deserve it most are usually the ones who talk about it least." The SEALs watched him go, their curiosity now thoroughly aroused. As Marcus walked across the base parking lot, he could feel their eyes on him through the club windows. He had no doubt that by evening, they would be discussing the mysterious civilian volunteer who seemed to know far more about military life than he was willing to admit. The speculation about Marcus began almost immediately after he left the base. Rodriguez, Williams, and several other SEALs found themselves gathered in the team room that evening, discussing the mysterious civilian who had given them the most practical transition briefing they had ever heard. "Guy knows way too much about how the system really works," Williams said, scrolling through his phone. "Most civilians who work with veterans only know the basics. This guy was talking about loopholes and workarounds that take years to figure out." Rodriguez nodded in agreement. "And did you see how he carried himself? Especially when we were walking across the base. He wasn't looking around like a tourist. He was checking exits, noting positions. That's operational awareness." Petty Officer Johnson, who had been quiet during the lunch conversation, spoke up. "I ran his name through the basic database. Marcus Rivera, 42 years old, Navy veteran. But the details are classified above my access level. That's weird for someone who's supposedly just a support guy." Patterson looked up from the report he was writing. "What do you mean, classified?" "I mean, I can't see his service record, his units, his deployments, nothing. Either he was involved in something sensitive or there's an error in the system." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Standard Navy service records were accessible to anyone with basic security clearance. The only records that were heavily restricted were those involving special operations, intelligence work, or classified programs. "Maybe he was intel," Rodriguez suggested. "That would explain why he's good with paperwork and details." Williams shook his head. "Intel guys don't usually have that kind of physical awareness, and they definitely don't brush off questions the way he does. He's not uncomfortable talking about his service. He's deliberately not talking about it." Over the next few days, the SEALs found themselves increasingly curious about Marcus Rivera. It became a sort of unofficial investigation, with team members casually asking around the base to see if anyone knew anything about the civilian volunteer. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Chief Petty Officer Martinez, a senior enlisted man with over 20 years of service, overheard them discussing Marcus in the base exchange. "You talking about the guy who gave the transition briefing?" Martinez asked, joining their conversation. "Tall guy, quiet, works at the VA? You know him?" Rodriguez asked eagerly. Martinez nodded slowly. "Not personally, but I've heard the name. My cousin works at the VA in San Diego. Says there's a volunteer there who goes by the same name, helps veterans with disability claims. Word is he's gotten more complex cases approved than anyone else in the system." "Complex how?" Patterson wanted to know. "PTSD cases that other people couldn't get through. Combat-related injuries that the system usually denies. The kind of claims that require someone who really understands what happened over there." Martinez paused, studying their faces. "Why the interest?" Williams explained their meeting with Marcus, his evasiveness about his service and the classified records. Martinez listened without interruption, his expression growing more thoughtful as the story continued. "You know," Martinez said finally, "there was something that happened about 15 years ago, before your time. Mission that got classified so deep that even the guys who were there couldn't talk about it. Naval Special Warfare was involved, but not SEALs. Something else. Something that officially never happened." The young SEALs exchanged glances. The military was full of rumors about black operations and units that didn't officially exist. Most of them were just stories, but occasionally you heard something that had the ring of truth. "What kind of something else?" Johnson asked. Martinez shrugged. "Above my pay grade. But I remember the time frame because it was right after 9/11, when everyone was scrambling to set up new units and new missions. A lot of good people got pulled into programs that didn't have names." That evening, Rodriguez found himself back at the VA office. He had told himself he was there to follow up on some paperwork from the transition briefing, but in reality, he was hoping to run into Marcus and maybe learn something more about the enigmatic volunteer. Marcus was in his usual conference room, working with an older veteran who appeared to be struggling with a complicated disability claim. Through the glass door, Rodriguez could see Marcus's patient demeanor as he walked the veteran through various forms and documents. When the session ended, Rodriguez knocked on the door frame. "Marcus, sorry to interrupt. I had a follow-up question about the VA education benefits." Marcus looked up, a slight smile crossing his face. "Rodriguez, right? Come on in. What can I help you with?" As Rodriguez asked his prepared questions about education benefits, he found himself studying Marcus more carefully. The man's answers were detailed and knowledgeable, but there was something else, a way of speaking that suggested familiarity with operational planning and risk assessment. "You're really good at this," Rodriguez said when Marcus finished explaining the various education programs. "How long have you been volunteering here?" "About 3 years," Marcus replied. "Started after I moved to the area." "Moved from where?" Marcus's pause was barely perceptible, but Rodriguez caught it. "Virginia," Marcus said finally. "Northern Virginia." Rodriguez knew that Northern Virginia was home to Pentagon, CIA headquarters, and dozens of other government agencies that didn't advertise their existence. It was where people went to work on things that required security clearances and official denials. "What brought you here?" Rodriguez pressed gently. "Change of scenery," Marcus said, beginning to organize the papers on his desk. "Sometimes you need to start fresh somewhere new." As Rodriguez prepared to leave, he noticed Marcus rolling up his sleeves to wash his hands at the small sink in the corner of the room. For just a moment, the full extent of his forearm tattoo was visible. What Rodriguez had thought was a simple anchor was actually much more complex. The anchor was there, but it was surrounded by other elements that he couldn't make out clearly from across the room. "Marcus," Rodriguez said impulsively, "that tattoo, it's not just an anchor, is it?" Marcus paused in his hand-washing, glancing down at his arm. "No," he said quietly. "It's not just an anchor. What is it?" Marcus dried his hands slowly, rolling his sleeves back down as he did so. "It's a reminder," he said finally, "of people who didn't make it home." The weight in his voice stopped Rodriguez from asking any more questions. There was something in Marcus's tone that spoke of losses that went deeper than statistics, of memories that carried a pain that time hadn't healed. "I'm sorry," Rodriguez said, meaning it. Marcus nodded, his expression softening. "We all carry something, Rodriguez. Your team, my old unit, every veteran who walks through that door. The trick is learning to carry it without letting it carry you." As Rodriguez left the VA office that evening, he found himself thinking about Marcus's words. There had been something in the older man's voice that spoke of experience with loss on a scale that most people never encountered. It was the voice of someone who had seen things that weren't supposed to happen, who had been places that didn't officially exist. Back at the base, Rodriguez shared his observations with the team. The more they learned about Marcus Rivera, the more mysterious he became. And the more mysterious he became, the more determined they were to understand who he really was and what he had done during his service to his country. The investigation into Marcus Rivera's background had become an obsession for the SEAL team. What had started as casual curiosity had evolved into something approaching a formal intelligence-gathering operation. The more elusive the truth became, the more determined they were to uncover it. Rodriguez had taken the lead in what they jokingly called Operation Rivera. His natural persistence and attention to detail made him ideally suited for the task. Over the past week, he had been methodically working through every contact and resource he could think of. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Rodriguez's girlfriend, Jessica, worked as a contractor for a government agency that she couldn't name, but that required a high-level security clearance. When Rodriguez mentioned his frustration with the classified service records, Jessica offered to make some discreet inquiries through her professional network. "I can't promise anything," she had warned him, "and if I find something, it might not be something you want to know." 3 days later, Jessica called Rodriguez with a request to meet her for lunch off base. Her voice carried a tension that immediately put him on alert. They met at a small diner 20 minutes from the naval station, the kind of place that specialized in anonymity and quiet conversations. Jessica was already there when Rodriguez arrived, sitting in a corner booth with her back to the wall and a clear view of the entrance. "You found something," Rodriguez said as he slid into the seat across from her. Jessica nodded, but her expression was troubled. "I found something. But Rodriguez, I need you to understand that what I'm about to tell you goes nowhere. Not to your team, not to your command, nowhere. I can't promise that without knowing what it is. Then this conversation ends right here." Jessica's tone was firm. "Some secrets exist for good reasons. This is one of them." Rodriguez studied her face, seeing a seriousness that was unusual for their normally light-hearted relationship. "Okay, I understand." Jessica pulled a small notebook from her purse, glancing around the diner before opening it. "Marcus Rivera. Served in the Navy from 1999 to 2009, but his official record ends There because everything after 2002 is classified, under a black program designation. What kind of black program? The kind that officially doesn't exist. The kind where even acknowledging that you know about it can end careers. Jessica paused, seeming to weigh her words carefully. Have you ever heard of DevGru? Rodriguez had heard of DevGru, also known as SEAL Team 6. It was the Navy's most elite counterterrorism unit, the team that had taken out Osama bin Laden, but he had never heard of any connection to other naval special warfare programs. What does DevGru have to do with this? DevGru wasn't the only elite unit that was expanded after 9/11. There were other programs, other teams that were created to handle missions that were too sensitive for traditional special operations. Marcus Rivera was part of one of those programs. Jessica turned a page in her notebook, revealing what appeared to be a copied document with most of the text redacted. What I could find suggests that he was involved in something called Task Force Blue Light, deep cover operations, in places that the United States was not officially operating. Rodriguez felt a chill run down his spine. He was beginning to understand why Marcus had been so evasive about his service record. The people in these programs, Jessica continued, they were chosen for very specific skills: intelligence, languages, cultural adaptability. They were sent places where if they were captured or killed, the United States would deny any knowledge of their existence. How do you know all this? Jessica closed the notebook and looked directly at Rodriguez. Because 5 years ago I worked on the psychological evaluation program for veterans coming out of classified units. We saw a lot of people who had been through things that officially never happened. The weight of what she was telling him was beginning to sink in. Marcus Rivera wasn't just a Navy veteran who preferred privacy. He was someone who had spent years operating in the shadows, doing things that his country could never acknowledge. There's more, Jessica said quietly. The tattoo you mentioned. The one with the anchor that's not just an anchor. I think I know what it is. She pulled out her phone and showed Rodriguez a photograph she had found online. It was a memorial wall at a private facility in Virginia, covered with names and symbols. Among the symbols was an anchor surrounded by a triangle and other elements that Rodriguez couldn't identify. This is a memorial for people who died in operations that can't be officially recognized. The symbols represent different units and programs. If Marcus has that tattoo, it means he lost people. Friends, teammates, maybe an entire unit. Rodriguez stared at the photo, understanding finally clicking into place. Marcus's reluctance to discuss his service, his deep knowledge of veteran services, his ability to help people navigate complex disability claims, it all made sense now. What happened to Task Force Blue Light? Rodriguez asked. Officially, it never existed. Unofficially, the program was disbanded around 2009. Budget cuts, changing priorities, political considerations. The people who were in it were reassigned, retired, or in some cases, just disappeared into civilian life with new identities. Jessica put her phone away and leaned across the table. Rodriguez, you need to understand something. If Marcus Rivera is who I think he is, then he's someone who sacrificed everything for his country. His identity, his past, maybe even his family. And in return, his country pretends he never existed. The drive back to the base was a blur for Rodriguez. His mind was reeling with the implications of what Jessica had told him. The casual arrogance he and his teammates had shown toward Marcus now seemed not just inappropriate, but offensive. That evening, the SEAL team gathered in their usual spot in the team room. Rodriguez had been dreading this moment, knowing that he couldn't share what he had learned, but also knowing that his teammates deserved to understand that they had been wrong about Marcus. So, Williams said, as Rodriguez entered the room, any luck with the Rivera investigation? Rodriguez took a deep breath. We need to drop it. The room went quiet. Patterson looked up from his computer. What do you mean, drop it? I mean, we were wrong to dig into his background. Marcus Rivera served his country in ways that we don't have the clearance to understand. And if he doesn't want to talk about it, we need to respect that. Johnson laughed. Come on, Rodriguez. What could be so secret that we can't know about it? We have top secret clearances. There are things above top secret, Rodriguez said quietly. Things that are compartmentalized so tightly that even having the highest clearance doesn't mean you have access to everything. The laughter died. These men understood classification levels and the principle of need to know. If Rodriguez was suggesting that Marcus's service was classified beyond their access level, then they were dealing with something far more serious than they had realized. "What did you find out?" Patterson asked. Rodriguez shook his head. "Nothing I can share, but enough to know that we owe that man an apology. A big one." As the team processed this information, Rodriguez found himself thinking about Marcus's words from their last conversation. "We all carry something." Now he understood what Marcus had been carrying and why a simple anchor tattoo meant so much more than any of them could have imagined. The weight of what Rodriguez had learned hung over the SEAL team like a storm cloud. For 3 days they went about their normal routines, but the easy camaraderie that usually marked their interactions was replaced by an uncomfortable awareness of their own assumptions. Williams was the first to voice what they were all thinking. "We screwed up, didn't we?" They were gathered in the team room after a training exercise, still in their gear but too restless to focus on equipment maintenance. The question hung in the air, demanding an honest answer that none of them wanted to give. "Yeah," Patterson said finally. "We did." Rodriguez had been dreading this conversation, but he knew it was necessary. His teammates deserved to understand the magnitude of their mistake, even if he couldn't share the specific details of what he had learned. "Look," Rodriguez said, "I can't tell you exactly what I found out, but I can tell you that Marcus Rivera is the kind of person we should have been honoring, not questioning." Johnson, who had been quiet since Rodriguez's revelation 3 days earlier, spoke up. "So what do we do now?" "Show up at the VA and say, 'Sorry, we thought you were just a clerk.'" "That's exactly what we do," Patterson said firmly. "We apologize, properly, and then we figure out how to make it right." The decision to visit Marcus at the VA office was unanimous, but the execution proved more challenging than any of them had anticipated. How do you apologize for disrespecting someone's service when you can't acknowledge what you learned about that service? They arrived at the VA office on Friday afternoon, out of uniform and clearly uncomfortable. Sarah Chen looked surprised to see 6 young men in civilian clothes asking to speak with Marcus Rivera. "He's in conference room A with a client," she told them, "but he should be finished soon if you'd like to wait." The waiting area of the VA office was filled with veterans of all ages and backgrounds. As the SEALs sat among them, they began to notice things they had missed before. The way some of the older veterans moved with barely perceptible limps, the careful way others scanned the room before taking a seat, the quiet conversations about disability ratings and denied claims. "These are our people," Williams murmured so quietly that only his teammates could hear, "and we've been acting like we're better than them." When Marcus emerged from the conference room with an elderly veteran, he seemed genuinely surprised to see the SEAL team waiting for him. His expression was neutral, but Rodriguez could detect a wariness that hadn't been there before. "Gentlemen," Marcus said with a slight nod, "this is unexpected." Patterson stood, his military bearing evident even in civilian clothes. "Marcus, we were hoping we could have a few minutes of your time. We owe you a conversation." Marcus studied their faces, seeming to weigh the request. Finally, he nodded toward the empty conference room. "5 minutes. I have another appointment soon." Once they were seated around the familiar table, Patterson struggled to find the right words. How do you apologize for arrogance without admitting to an investigation that should never have happened? "Marcus," Patterson began, "we came here to apologize. Our behavior toward you has been unprofessional and disrespectful." Marcus raised an eyebrow but said nothing, waiting for the explanation. Rodriguez took over. "We made assumptions about your background based on limited information. We questioned your credibility and your right to advise us about military transition issues." "And now?" Marcus asked quietly. "Now we understand that we were wrong," Williams said. "We don't know the details of your service and we don't need to. What we know is that you've dedicated yourself to helping veterans, and we treated that dedication with suspicion instead of gratitude." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his fingers absently rubbing the spot on his forearm, where his tattoo was hidden beneath his sleeve. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that made all 6 SEALs lean forward slightly. "Do you know what I see when I look at you?" Marcus asked. "I see myself 20 years ago, confident, capable, certain that my experience was the only experience that mattered." He paused, looking at each of them in turn. "I see young warriors who have earned the right to be proud of their service. But pride can become arrogance if you're not careful, and arrogance can blind you to the value of other people's sacrifices." Johnson shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "We understand that now, sir. Do you?" Marcus asked. Because understanding and knowing are two different things. You can understand intellectually that every veteran has a story worth respecting, but knowing it, feeling it in your bones, that comes from experience you haven't had yet. Rodriguez found himself thinking about Jessica's words about people who had sacrificed everything for their country, only to have that country pretend they never existed. He wondered if Marcus was one of those people, carrying secrets that could never be shared, bearing the weight of missions that officially never happened. What can we do to make this right? Patterson asked. Marcus smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious face. You can remember this conversation the next time you meet a veteran whose story doesn't fit your expectations. You can treat every person who served with the respect they deserve, regardless of whether their service looks like yours. He stood, signaling that their time was up. And you can continue to prepare yourselves for the transition you'll eventually face. Because whether you serve 4 years or 40, eventually you'll be sitting in civilian clothes in an office like this, trying to figure out how to translate what you've done into something the civilian world can understand. As the SEALs prepared to leave, Rodriguez made a decision that surprised even himself. Marcus, would you be willing to come back to the base? Not for another briefing, but as our guest. We'd like to show you the respect you should have received the first time. Marcus considered the request carefully. What did you have in mind? Dinner at the base club, Patterson said. With the team. A chance to start over. And this time, Williams added, we'll listen more and assume less. Marcus nodded slowly. I'd like that. When? They settled on the following Friday evening. As the SEALs left the VA office, they carried with them a new understanding of the complex world of military service and veteran affairs. They had learned that heroism came in many forms, and that some of the most important battles were fought by people whose names would never appear on any official record. Rodriguez lingered behind as his teammates walked to their cars. Marcus, he said quietly, thank you for giving us another chance. Marcus clasped his shoulder briefly. Everyone deserves a second chance, Rodriguez. The trick is making sure you don't need a third one. As Rodriguez walked across the parking lot, he found himself thinking about the upcoming dinner. It would be more than just a meal. It would be an opportunity to honor a man who had served his country in ways they might never fully understand, and to learn from someone who had already walked the path they would eventually travel themselves. The arrogance was gone, replaced by curiosity and respect. For the first time since they had met Marcus Rivera, the SEAL team was ready to truly listen to what he had to say. The week leading up to the dinner at the base club passed slowly for the SEAL team. Word of their invitation to Marcus had spread through the unit, generating curious questions from teammates who wondered why they were showing such interest in a civilian volunteer. Rodriguez found himself fielding most of these questions, trying to explain their change of heart without revealing the classified information he had learned. We misjudged him, became his standard response. Guy deserves better from us. Friday evening arrived with an unseasonable warmth that made the base feel more welcoming than usual. Marcus arrived at the main gate precisely on time, dressed in simple slacks and a button-down shirt that managed to look both civilian and somehow military at the same time. Patterson met him at the security checkpoint, noting how Marcus moved through the identification process with the automatic efficiency of someone who had done it countless times before. There was no hesitation, no confusion about procedures, just the smooth compliance of someone who understood military security protocols at an instinctive level. Thanks for coming, Patterson said as they walked toward the base club. The guys are looking forward to this. So am I, Marcus replied. It's been a while since I've been on a base as a guest rather than a visitor. The base club was busier than usual for a Friday evening, filled with sailors and their families enjoying the weekend atmosphere. The SEAL team had reserved a large table in a quiet corner, providing privacy for conversation while still maintaining the casual atmosphere they wanted. As Marcus approached the table, the 6 SEALs stood in unison, not quite at attention, but with a formality that marked this as something more than a casual dinner among friends. Rodriguez had briefed them beforehand about treating this as a chance to show proper respect, and their body language reflected that understanding. Marcus, Williams said as he approached. We're glad you could make it. Wouldn't miss it, Marcus replied, taking the seat they had left open for him at the head of the table. This is a nice setup you have here. The conversation started slowly, with the SEALs clearly making an effort to be more respectful than they had been during their previous encounters. They asked about his work at the VA, his thoughts on veteran services, and his opinions on various military policies, treating him as an expert rather than a curious outsider. Marcus seemed to sense their discomfort with the formality and gradually began steering the conversation toward lighter topics. He asked about their training, their deployment schedules, and their plans for the future. His questions were informed and intelligent, revealing a deep understanding of military life that went far beyond what a typical civilian would possess. "You know," Johnson said during a lull in the conversation, "we never did get a straight answer about what you did in the Navy." The table went quiet. Rodriguez shot Johnson a warning look, but Marcus held up a hand to indicate it was okay. "Fair question," Marcus said. "I was in Naval Special Warfare. Different community than yours, but same general neighborhood." It was the most direct answer he had given about his service, and the SEALs recognized it as a gesture of trust. They also recognized the careful phrasing. Naval Special Warfare was an umbrella term that covered everything from SEALs to special boat units to programs that didn't have public names. "What community?" Rodriguez asked gently. Marcus smiled, but there was something sad in his expression, one that doesn't exist anymore. Before anyone could ask a follow-up question, Marcus excused himself to use the restroom. As he walked away from the table, Williams noticed something that made him catch his breath. "Did you see that?" Williams whispered urgently. "See what?" Patterson asked. When he stood up, his sleeve pulled up. "I got a better look at that tattoo." Rodriguez felt his stomach drop. "What did you see?" "It's not just an anchor. There's a trident. And something else. Numbers, maybe." The table fell silent as the implications sank in. A trident was the symbol of Naval Special Warfare, worn by SEALs and other elite units. But Marcus had said he wasn't a SEAL, which meant he was something else entirely, something that officially didn't exist. When Marcus returned to the table, the atmosphere had changed subtly. The SEALs were looking at him with a new kind of respect, tinged with curiosity and growing understanding. "Everything okay?" Marcus asked, noting the change in mood. "Williams caught a glimpse of your tattoo," Rodriguez said honestly. "We're trying to figure out how to ask about it without being disrespectful again." Marcus looked down at his forearm, where the edge of the tattoo was barely visible below his sleeve. For a moment, he seemed to be weighing a decision that he had been avoiding for years. "You really want to know?" he asked finally. 6 heads nodded in unison. Marcus glanced around the restaurant, noting the positions of other diners and the general noise level. Then he slowly rolled up his sleeve, revealing the full extent of the tattoo for the first time. The design was complex and clearly meaningful. At the center was indeed a Navy anchor, but it was surrounded by a special warfare trident, a small triangle that Rodriguez now recognized as a symbol from the memorial wall Jessica had shown him, and a series of numbers that looked like coordinates. But it was the additional element that made the SEAL's breath catch. Wrapped around the anchor was a banner with names, first names only, but clearly meaningful to the man who wore them. "Mike, Danny, Carlos, Sarah, Alex," Williams read quietly. "My team," Marcus said simply. "Operation Midnight Sun, February 14th, 2007. Officially, we were never there. Officially, they never died." The table was completely silent. Even in the noisy restaurant, it felt like a bubble of quiet had settled around them. "I was the only one who came home," Marcus continued, his voice steady but carrying a weight that made every SEAL at the table understand exactly what he was talking about. 5 good people who died doing something that their country can never acknowledge, in a place that doesn't appear on any map. Rodriguez found himself thinking about all the assumptions they had made, all the casual dismissals of Marcus's credentials and background. This man hadn't just served his country. He had lost his entire team doing it, and then spent the next 15 years living with secrets he could never share. "That's why you work at the VA," Patterson said, understanding finally clicking into place. "You're helping people who can't help themselves." Marcus nodded. "Someone has to. The system isn't designed for people whose service doesn't fit the standard categories. People who were in places they weren't supposed to be, doing things that officially never happened." He rolled his sleeve back down, covering the tattoo and the memories it represented. "Your service is different from mine. Your sacrifices are different from mine, but we're all part of the same brotherhood. whether the paperwork says so or not. The dinner continued for another hour, but the conversation had fundamentally changed. The SEALs were no longer trying to figure out who Marcus Rivera was. They knew exactly who he was, and they understood the weight he carried every day. As they prepared to leave, Rodriguez spoke for all of them. "Marcus, we're honored that you shared that with us. And we're sorry it took us so long to understand." Marcus shook each of their hands in turn. "Don't be sorry. Just remember that every veteran has a story worth respecting, even if you never get to hear it." As they walked out into the evening air, the SEALs found themselves looking at Marcus Rivera with completely new eyes. He wasn't just a helpful civilian volunteer. He was a warrior who had paid the ultimate price for his service, not his life but his identity, his recognition, and his right to be remembered as the hero he truly was. The Monday morning after the dinner found the SEAL team assembled in their briefing room for what was supposed to be a routine meeting about upcoming training schedules. But the atmosphere was different than usual, quieter, more thoughtful, marked by a shared understanding that none of them had possessed a week earlier. Rodriguez had spent the weekend thinking about Marcus's revelation, about the names tattooed on his arm and what it meant to carry that kind of loss in silence. The easy confidence that had always marked the team's interactions now felt somehow hollow, replaced by a deeper awareness of what service could cost. The briefing room door opened, interrupting his thoughts. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell, their commanding officer, entered with her usual brisk efficiency. But behind her came an unexpected figure that made every SEAL in the room straighten in their chairs. Rear Admiral James Harrison, commander of Naval Special Warfare Command, stepped into the room with the quiet authority that marked senior officers who had earned their rank through operational excellence rather than political maneuvering. His presence at their base was unusual enough. His presence in their briefing room was unprecedented. "At ease," Admiral Harrison said as the SEALs began to rise. "This is an informal visit. Commander Mitchell, would you mind giving us a few minutes?" Mitchell nodded and left, closing the door behind her. The Admiral took a seat at the head of the conference table, his expression unreadable as he studied the 6 young operators before him. "I understand you gentlemen have been getting to know Marcus Rivera," the Admiral said without preamble. The SEALs exchanged glances. Rodriguez felt his stomach drop, wondering if their investigation into Marcus's background had somehow triggered official attention. "Yes, sir," Patterson replied carefully. "He's been working with us on transition planning." Admiral Harrison nodded slowly. "And how has that been going?" "Very well, sir," Williams said. "He's been extremely helpful with practical advice about veteran services." "I'm sure he has," the Admiral said. "Marcus Rivera is one of the most knowledgeable people in this area when it comes to helping veterans navigate the system. There's a reason for that." The room was completely silent. The SEALs could sense that they were about to learn something significant, but they weren't sure whether it would be good news or bad news. 15 years ago, Admiral Harrison continued, "I was a captain serving as deputy commander of a joint task force that officially didn't exist. Our mission was to handle operations that were too sensitive for traditional special operations units. We recruited people from across the special operations community, SEALs, Rangers, Delta Force, Air Force, Special Tactics. But we also recruited from places that most people have never heard of." He paused, looking at each SEAL in turn. "One of our most valuable operators was a young petty officer from a Naval Special Warfare unit that was so classified that even acknowledging its existence could end careers. His name was Marcus Rivera." Rodriguez felt his breath catch. Admiral Harrison was confirming what Jessica had told him, but hearing it from such a senior officer made it seem almost surreal. Rivera and his team were sent on missions that pushed the boundaries of what we asked people to do for their country. They operated in countries where we had no official presence, gathered intelligence that couldn't be obtained through normal channels, and neutralized threats that posed existential risks to American interests. The Admiral's voice took on a gravity that made every person in the room lean forward slightly. On February 14, 2007, Rivera's team was tasked with infiltrating a terrorist facility in a location that I still cannot name. The mission was successful. They prevented an attack that would have killed thousands of American civilians. But the cost was enormous. Admiral Harrison stood and walked to the window, looking out at the base where young sailors were going about their daily routines. unaware of the conversation taking place in the briefing room. Rivera lost his entire team that night. 5 of the finest operators I've ever had the privilege to command. They died as heroes, but because of the classified nature of their mission, their sacrifice could never be officially recognized. He turned back to face the SEALs. Marcus Rivera came home from that mission carrying wounds that went deeper than anything physical. He had lost not just his teammates, but his entire identity. The unit was disbanded, the mission was classified beyond any normal level, and the people who had served in it were essentially erased from official records. Johnson spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. What happened to him after that, sir? He was offered a new identity, a new assignment, a chance to continue serving in a different capacity. But Rivera chose a different path. He retired from active duty and dedicated himself to helping other veterans who had fallen through the cracks of the system. Admiral Harrison returned to his seat. For the past 15 years, Marcus Rivera has been working quietly to help veterans whose service doesn't fit the standard categories. Veterans from classified programs, people whose records are sealed, operators whose sacrifices can never be officially acknowledged. Rodriguez found his voice. "Sir, why are you telling us this?" "Because," Admiral Harrison said with a slight smile, "Rivera called me yesterday. He told me about your dinner, about how you had treated him initially, and about how you had worked to make things right. He was impressed with your willingness to acknowledge your mistakes and learn from them." The Admiral leaned forward, his expression becoming more serious. "But there's another reason I'm here. The transition program that Rivera has been helping you develop is about to become a model for the entire naval special warfare community. We're planning to expand it to every SEAL team, every special boat unit, every component of our organization." Patterson's eyes widened. "Sir?" "Marcus Rivera is going to be the senior advisor for the program, which means he'll be working closely with units across the command, sharing his expertise about transition challenges and veteran services." Admiral Harrison stood, signaling that the meeting was coming to an end. "But before we make this official, he wanted to make sure that you gentlemen were comfortable with the arrangement. After all, you'll be the pilot program for the expanded initiative." Williams spoke for all of them. "Sir, we would be honored to continue working with Marcus Rivera. He's already taught us more about service and sacrifice than we realized we needed to learn." "Good," the Admiral said, "because starting next week, Rivera will be spending 3 days a week on this base, working with your team and others to develop comprehensive transition resources. You'll have the opportunity to learn from someone who has already walked the path you'll eventually travel." As Admiral Harrison prepared to leave, he paused at the door. "One more thing, gentlemen. What Marcus Rivera shared with you about his service, about his team, about what happened in 2007, that stays in this room. The official records may never acknowledge what those people did, but we can honor their memory by protecting their legacy." After the Admiral left, the 6 SEALs sat in silence for several minutes, processing what they had just learned. Marcus Rivera wasn't just a helpful volunteer or even a fellow veteran. He was a genuine hero whose service had cost him everything, and who had chosen to dedicate his life to helping others navigate the same challenges he had faced. Rodriguez thought about the dinner, about the moment when Marcus had rolled up his sleeve and revealed the names of his fallen teammates. The man had trusted them with the most painful part of his story, and now they understood the full weight of that trust. "We really screwed up initially, didn't we?" Johnson said finally. "Yeah," Patterson replied, "but we learned from it. And maybe that's what Marcus was trying to teach us all along." Over the next few weeks, as Marcus began his expanded role with the command, the SEAL team found themselves serving as informal ambassadors for his program. They shared their experience with other units, emphasizing the importance of approaching transition planning with humility and respect for the knowledge that experienced veterans could provide. Marcus, for his part, seemed to find new purpose in his official role. The man who had spent 15 years helping veterans in quiet anonymity now had the platform and resources to make a much larger impact. The anchor tattoo on his forearm remained hidden beneath his sleeve most of the time, but the SEAL team now understood its true significance. It wasn't just a memorial to fallen comrades. It was a reminder that service came in many forms, that heroism wasn't always recognized, and that the most important battles were sometimes fought by people whose names would never appear in any official record. They had learned to look beyond their own experience, to recognize that every veteran carried a story worth respecting, and they had learned this lesson from a man who embodied the very best of what it meant to serve, even when that service came at the ultimate personal cost. In the end, Marcus Rivera had taught them something more valuable than any tactical skill or operational technique. He had taught them that true honor wasn't found in recognition or acknowledgement, but in the quiet dedication to serving something larger than yourself, even when no one would ever know your name.